Did you know that a king in ancient Israel once took a census, just counted his people, and it supposedly resulted in a plague that killed 70,000? It sounds, well,
Right.
pretty extreme, right?
It really does, especially to our modern ears. We rely so much on census data today. But yeah, that's the story we're digging into, King David's census, this devastating plague. And it all centers around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
What was going on? Why did he suddenly want this head count?
Well, the context suggests he just had some major military victories, beaten the Syrians, the Ammonites. So one interpretation is that maybe a bit of pride crept in.
Pride, like wanting to see just how big and powerful his kingdom had become?
Exactly. Maybe wanting to quantify his military might, perhaps thinking about future campaigns, or just feeling secure in his numbers rather than, well, divine support.
But his top general, Joab, he wasn't keen on this at all, was he?
Not one bit. Joab actually argued pretty strongly against it. He basically said, look, God's already blessed us. The numbers are huge. Why do this? Why bring guilt on Israel? He seemed genuinely worried.
Guilt. Was there some kind of rule about counting people?
There was a precedent, yeah. Back in Exodus, chapter 30, I think, it says if you number the fighting men, each one has to pay a ransom, like a small temple tax.
Ransom. Why?
It was sort of an atonement, a way to acknowledge that the people ultimately belonged to God, not the king, and specifically to prevent a plague from breaking out when they were counted. David's census seems to have skipped that part.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't just counting, it was how and maybe why he was counting. And Joab's resistance, it really showed, didn't it? It took him ages.
Oh, absolutely. The text says it took him, 290 days? That's almost 10 months. Yeah, traveling from Beersheba in the south to Dan in the north. And even then, he didn't count everyone. He left out the tribes of Levi and Benjamin because it says the king's command was abhorrent to him.
He really dug his heels in. So after nearly a year, what were the final numbers? How big was this army David was potentially feeling proud about?
The numbers are pretty staggering. 11,100,000 men who could draw the sword in Israel and 470,000 in Judah.
Okay, wait, that's nearly 1.6 million men.
Yep. Just for context, think about this. That's actually larger than the entire active duty military of the United States today.
No way, really?
Yeah. Gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about and maybe why pride could have been a factor.
That does put it in perspective. So David ignores Joab, goes against precedent, gets this massive number, and then the consequence hits.
It does. The narrative is pretty clear. God was displeased with the census, and it was a plague that swept through Israel.
A devastating one, as we mentioned, 70,000 deaths. How did David react when he realized what his order had caused?
He seems to have been genuinely conscience-stricken. The text says his heart struck him, and he confessed to God, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. I have acted very foolishly. He took responsibility.
So after this confession, God sends the prophet Gad to him, but not with immediate forgiveness, right? There's a choice involved.
Right. Gad presents David with three options, three forms of judgment. It's quite dramatic. 3 years of famine across the land.
Oh.
Or 3 months of being defeated and pursued by your enemies.
Also bad.
Or 3 days of plague described as the sword of the Lord, an epidemic striking the land.
3 terrible choices. What a position to be in. Why did he choose the plague?
It's interesting. David's reasoning, according to the text, was that he preferred to fall into God's hands because his mercy is great, rather than falling into the hands of humans, meaning his enemies in war. He seemed to trust God's character even in judgment.
That's a complex thought process in a moment of crisis. So the 3-day plague begins, and this is where the location becomes really important, isn't it? Jerusalem, the Temple Mount.
Exactly. The story says the angel of the Lord, the one carrying out the plague, reached Jerusalem and was seen standing over the city with a drawn sword, a terrifying image.
You can imagine. And David sees this.
David and the elders, dressed in sackcloth, see this vision, and David cries out to God again. He basically pleads, wasn't it I who commanded the count? I'm the one who sinned. Let your hand be against me and my family, but please, not these people, not your sheep.
He offers himself instead. That's quite a moment.
It is, and right after that plea, God, through the prophet Gad, gives David a specific instruction.
Which is?
Go and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of a man named Ornan the Jebusite.
Ornan's threshing floor. Okay, tell us about Ornan. What happens when David shows up there?
Well, Ornan is there threshing wheat. The text adds this detail that Ornan looks up, sees the angel, and his 4 sons who are with him hide themselves. But Ornan, he keeps working.
He sees the angel bringing the plague and
yeah,
keeps threshing wheat.
It's a striking image, isn't it? Some see it as a sign of, faithfulness amidst chaos. Threshing wheat, separating grain from chaff. It's essential work. Maybe it symbolizes sticking to your task even when things are terrifying. His name, Ornan, apparently means something like Jehovah is firm.
Interesting connection. And what happens when David approaches him?
Ornan sees the king coming, bows down, and asks why he's there. David explains he wants to buy the threshing floor to build an altar to stop the plague.
And Ornan is just going to hand it over.
He actually offers more. He says, take it, and look, here are the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges for wood, the wheat for the grain offering. I give it all. A really generous impulse.
Wow. But David refuses the gift.
He insists on buying it. He says, no, I insist on buying it for the full price. I will not take for the Lord what is yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing.
That cost me nothing. That feels like a really important principle.
It does. True sacrifice involves actual cost. So David pays him 600 shekels of gold for the site, which, by the way, would be a huge amount of money today, maybe close to $500,000, depending on how you calculate it.
Okay, so he buys the land fair and square, then he builds the altar.
He builds the altar right there, offers the burnt offerings and peace offerings, and calls on the Lord. And then comes another dramatic moment. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes the burnt offering.
Fire from heaven, a clear sign of acceptance.
An unmistakable sign. And it connects this place to other key moments. Tradition holds this is the same mountain, Moriah, where Abraham was willing to offer Isaac.
Right.
And it's the exact spot where David's son, Solomon, will later build the temple. And guess what happened at the temple's dedication?
Let me guess. Fire from heaven.
You got it. So this event with David and the altar firmly establishes this specific location as incredibly sacred ground.
And crucially, after David builds the altar, makes the sacrifice.
The plague stops. God commands the angel to put his sword back in its sheath. David's repentance, his intercession, and the costly sacrifice at that specific place marked the end of the judgment.
It's such a dense story. When we step back from the narrative itself, what kind of broader themes or maybe lessons can we kind of pull out of this, thinking about it impartially?
Well, one obvious theme is the danger of pride, especially for leaders. David's initial act seems rooted in self-reliance, maybe forgetting where his strength truly came from. Joab's warning serves as a reminder about listening to counsel, even when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, and the consequences weren't just personal for David, were they? They hit the entire nation.
Exactly. It underscores that leadership actions have wide ripples. Decisions made out of ego or without considering the maybe spiritual or ethical dimensions can have devastating costs for everyone.
But then David's response is also key, the repentance, the taking responsibility, even offering himself.
Absolutely. It shows a path toward reconciliation. It wasn't just saying sorry. It involved action, sacrifice, and humility. That seems crucial to the resolution.
And the location itself, Ornan's threshing floor on Mount Moriah, that seems significant too.
Definitely. Choosing a place of work, of sustenance, like a threshing floor, for the place of atonement is interesting. It connects a sacred act back to everyday life. And David insisting on paying highlights that reconciliation, making things right, often requires a genuine cost, not just, empty gestures.
So we started with that question. Why could simply counting people lead to a massive plague? Hopefully walking through the details, the context of pride, the disregarded traditions, Joab's warning, the ransom idea, David's repentance, the significance of the location gives you a much fuller picture.
It really does. It's a complex account with layers of meaning about leadership, humility, consequence, and reconciliation. Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you to consider. Thinking about this ancient story, how do you see these dynamics, things like national pride, the consequences of leadership choices, the need for humility playing out in history or even today? And regardless of your own beliefs, what might it mean for any of us to act with faithfulness and maybe humility when facing big challenges or uncertainties?